Okay.
Okay. No, yes, please.
So everybody, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us on this historic day. The first female Black Asian vice president. Wow, that got me all choked up just saying all those things. It's a big day. I'm really grateful to see all your faces. And I actually couldn't be prouder to have this training on this day. It kind of fell on it by chance, but we're really grateful to Dr. Hodo, for taking the time and hanging out with us. So if there aren't any questions before we begin, anything that anybody needs to, any questions real quick, then we will, without further ado, begin. And Dr. Hodo, it's yours. Go Bills.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll present, but I want to make sure that I do leave time because that was one of the things like at the end. So I have no issue staying on, answering questions, having dialogue, whatever you want. Okay. So, I mean, if you guys want to have conversations after, remember the only stupid question is the one that's not asked. That truly is the only stupid one. I think that you're on here with peers. I'm definitely not judgmental at all. I'd rather have people ask me than assume stuff so we can have a conversation after. So I want to talk to you today, just basically like, how did we get here? Today is indeed very historic. You may see me rocking my pearls because now this is the first time like a glass ceiling has been shattered, but in the African-American community, we call it a concrete ceiling because it tends to be more difficult for women of color. So glass and concrete should be everywhere, right? So we've seen that today, and that is definitely a historic moment. So today's agenda, I just wanted to talk a little bit about race versus ethnicity. We're going to talk about institutional racism because we need to understand how we've gotten here and how, inequality continues to be very much embedded in our institutions in America. And we need to remember when these institutions were founded, think about it, women, typically couldn't own property. People of African Americans were enslaved. Native Americans had suffered genocide. So there were a variety of things happening. So we have to understand that when these institutions were founded, it was very much by cisgendered white men who had money, very affluent. So, and then we'll do our conclusion. So race is just a social construct. It's not biologically real, but we see that it tends to be reserved for people who have significant or obvious visible differences than the European race. So we see that with Japanese American, Chinese American, oftentimes people who are of Arab descent, Filipinos, African Americans, Negroes, colored or Black. It depends on which census you look at. But ethnicity is really what we all are, which is that that's what sets us apart.
I think we've muted Tammy.
Yeah, Dr. Hodo, you're muted.
Okay, yeah, because you muted me. It said the host muted me. But can you hear me now? Can you guys hear me?
Yes. Hey, Dr. Hodo, we see the first slide still. Is that what we're supposed to see?
Oh, no, we should be, okay, hold on, let me get you there.
No worries. I just wanted to.
Thank you. No, I'm glad you told me because
no worries. And I accidentally muted you when I was trying to mute somebody who had that microphone reverb. So that's why. Sorry about that.
No, it's no worries. Do you see the race and ethnicity slide or do you still see yoga for change?
We still see the intro slide.
Okay. Let's do this.
Now we see the agenda slide.
Okay.
Cool.
Give me a moment. I'm trying to have 3 screens here. I'm trying to see.
We're flexible, Dr. Hodo.
I know, right? Yoga. I love it. Love it. Love it. For some reason, it will not let me do the slideshow on this screen. Yeah, just slideshow, resume slideshow. Okay. Okay, it still doesn't want to do that. Let's see. Just bear with me one moment, please. Okay, slideshow. we're just gonna roll with it. Okay. Can you guys see the race versus ethnicity slide?
Ma'am.
All right, good. Okay, so like I was saying, so race is not real biologically, right? Because if you think about it, I could get a kidney from someone, my heart could go to someone else. What would matter is blood type and things like that. But what we all are is ethnic. So, we lived in Europe for quite some time, and over there, they really base it on national origin. So, you're German, you're Irish, you're Polish, things of that nature. But in America, race is very much part of the fabric of our society. And ethnicity, we tend to, is reserved for those with cultural distinctions and customs. And most Americans learn about other ethnicities, I think you all would agree, by food. So we tend to understand or know of other ethnicities through food. So some of the examples of different ethnic groups would be Hispanics, Latinx, which in turn, includes Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans. But Dominicans, if they look like me, people would assume that they're African American and put them in that social construct of race. But we also know that there are ethnic groups in the Caucasian ethnicity, right? So either you're Irish, Polish, Italian, Welsh, English, things of that nature. So we do see those differences. When you look at race versus ethnicity, we have to be mindful that, in 1860, the census only had three categories. So they had white, black, or mulatto. Mulatto is a pretty offensive word to me. That is for someone like myself who is half European and half African American. But this is what the initial census looked like. I'm not sure if you all know, but it wasn't until the 2000 census that they added biracial or people of more than one race, even though race is a social construct. But we see that it changes on the census. So I tell people in my TED talk, when my father was born, he was born a Negro. When my parents married, he was considered colored. Then in the 70s, because of the Black Power movement, he was considered Black. Then in the 80s, he was considered African American. His complexion never changed, but the census, the way the census counted and categorized him did. At one point, we used to have Japanese and Asian separated, but now they just lump them together as Asian. So this just shows you just how dynamic the ideal of race is. And as you see from this slide, the social construct of it tends to change. So Irish at one point were not considered Caucasian or white. Polish, people of Italian descent, people of Greek descent, they were not considered white. But now, since the late 1900s, late 20th century, everyone's kind of been absorbed into this construct of whiteness and not recognizing their ethnicity. Often I've talked with students and in my racial and ethnic minority course, and I will say, well, what ethnicity are you? And they say they're white. And I explain to them that that's a color. And, and race is not real, it's just a social construct. But what is their, country of origin, the language their ancestors spoke, things of that nature. So when we see, some very discriminatory, signs here, we serve whites only, no gypsies, Polish, Irish, no blacks, no dogs. Only native born Americans need apply. So just, no Italians allowed. I'm not sure if anyone knows this, but the largest mass lynching in America was of 12 Sicilians in New Orleans. And they were accused of killing a sheriff. And they lynched them all at one time. So that was the largest mass lynching, was of actual Sicilians, because again, they were not considered to be Caucasian. So some of the ways that we've seen like this institutional racism, or the way it is displayed in our nation, is if we think of boarding schools, which we had at one point for our indigenous population. And I'm going to share a short video with you about that. because I always have to share about the natives because all this land is their land and we're occupying it. And American slavery was another form of institutional racism. Just because something is legal doesn't mean that it's morally right. We've seen racism in medicine, and we could talk a bit about that in regards to why you see some communities of color that are particularly suspect of the vaccine when it comes to COVID, but there's a history of medical maltreatment of people of color. We've also seen educational policies that have been very discriminatory. When you think about, we had to go to the Supreme Court, Brown versus Board of Education. I'm not sure how many of you all may be in the Duval County School District, but I often share this is that Jacksonville, Duval County is the 20th largest school district in the US. They're the 6th largest in Florida, but they're number 1 in the state of Florida for referring African-American and Latino students to law enforcement for disciplinary reasons. So that is an institutional issue. I know teachers do not make enough, and I believe it is bias that they're not even aware of, and that's a topic for another time. But we'll also talk about Executive Order 10450, which actually banned homosexuals from being able to be federal employees. So we've seen a variety of institutional racism just showing up in a variety of ways. So it's so embedded in our structures in American society. It's the mechanisms and by which we continue to see inequalities persist and disparities continue. It's in policies and practices that are built into various social institutions, and they continue to reproduce themselves. So if anyone's read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which is a bit old at this point, or if you're currently reading Caste, you'll find that basically the system has changed the mechanisms by which to continue to marginalize certain groups has changed, but we continue to see the same outcome. So this video I'm going to show you is about the indigenous population and how they were pushed into boarding schools with this whole ideal of assimilating them into European ways. And it was this ideal of kill the savage and save the man. And that was the actual language used. So at the beginning, as I play this, there'll be no sound, it will be words, but then you begin to hear sound as you hear the children begin to sing. You should begin to hear the sound now.
Indians. That's a song that was counting dead Indians back on the trails when they would kill Indians.
Oh, Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was turning it up. Sorry. To get us to where we were.
The 10 Little Indians. That's a song that was counting dead Indians back on the trails when they would kill Indians.
See all these little kids in uniform, and we'd be wondering how come they're like that. We weren't dressed like that, but these little kids were.
I remember being younger, growing up on a reservation, and being told, don't trust white people, don't listen to them. You never told why.
The government schools are constantly being built and hospitals added. We bring them in, clean them up, and start them on their way to civilization.
I would ask social services and human services audience, how many people know about residential boarding schools? How many people here do? This never makes it into the history books. This is never talked about.
Why did those schools get started, and who started them, and what was the rationale behind it?
And the first general policy was the only good Indian was a dead Indian, that we needed to be killed, exterminated, eradicated. Once they realized that's a little bit more difficult to do, is to have mass genocide of a population, the policies changed from killing to killing the Indian and saving the man. There's a General Pratt who was well famous and documented for using those words to kill the Indian and save the man, and that we are subhuman and that our ways are savage and we need to be civilized. Well, in the governments in Canada and the United States followed that policy up until the 1980s in one form or another.
There is a boarding school far, far away where we get mush and milk 3 times a day. Oh, how the huskies run when they hear their dinner bell. Oh, how the huskies run 3 times a day. Like I say, I went to the mush hole when I was 4 years old. I was there for 9 years. And once in a while we'd come home in summertime, but not all the time. When the counselors came and told my dad that he couldn't raise us properly, we were at the mush hole 1 week and our heads were full of bugs.
Well, there's a lot of sad times, but I mean, like, I didn't get like angry and have any resentment until after I got out, because I didn't know, like, from 5.5 to 16, I just thought it was just like a normal upbringing, like to not have no parents and stuff like that. So that's and after I got out, and then they thought, well, this is the way they were supposed to be treating us.
I think my mother couldn't take care of us because our father was into alcohol. Me and my sister, we started there in 1945. I was 5 years old at the time.
We had all our hair cut off. We were made baldies. We were really bald. And that wasn't a very good feeling to have. And they used to call us mush hole baldies. That's what the kids on the reserve used to call us.
Oh, we can go in now. I mean, this is going to take like all day, eh? Jeez.
We were taken to the hospital to get checked out for nits and whatever, I guess that was, you know. Well, they checked us out, you know. Then they split us. The school was split in age group and by the boys and girls. Boys were on one side, the girls were on one side. And they went from the lower age up to high school level.
My mom was gonna walk out here and go out this door. And at 5.5, my sister tells me that I grabbed my mom's leg and of course we were all just crying. The whole four of us were just crying. Like, because my mom was gonna leave us here. So I grabbed my mom's leg and, crying and that, and just kind of like hollering like, "Ma, don't leave me," like, So, but anyway, like while that was going on, like the supervisor came over and just kind of grabbed me and took me off my mom's leg, and then my mom just walked out, and I've never seen her for those 10 years that I was here. She never come to see me once. I don't know why.
They took my brother away to where he was supposed to stay, and my sister, she just went on her own. I was with most of the 4 and 5-year-olds. We didn't go to school because we were too young.
Yet, through the agencies of the government, they are being rapidly brought from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism to one of civilization.
When we used our language, at that young age too, we were just learning. So they used to wash our mouth out with soap. They would take the whole bunch of us and march us to the coal shower, and they'd throw us in there and beat us along the way. And that was a routine thing, I guess. I don't know. But that taught us,
They'd throw us in this dark press room where they kept all our Sunday go-to-meeting clothes, and they'd throw Rosemary and I in there and tell us the rats were going to get us. But I didn't know then why I was being thrown in there, and I used to wonder, what did I do? And I would cry, and Rosemary would cry, and we cried and cried for hours in there, not knowing why we were in there. And they'd take us out. And when I did get to learn a little bit of English, I knew then they were throwing us in there because we wouldn't speak English. And I must have been stubborn right from the day I was born, because I thought to myself, I'll never speak English either. You want me to speak English? I won't speak English. So I didn't speak at all for 2 whole years, because I figured if I spoke Indian, I could lickin'. And if I spoke English, then it would be against everything that I stood for. And so I didn't speak at all.
But today, they all speak English, and some have taken business courses, home economics, and other higher training.
Took us into another room down there, and maybe down in the playroom, we took all our clothes off and we put the clothes of the school on. Yeah, and they give us a number. So my number was like 48, and my brother was 36.
My family was the state-run institute, and the nickname for the Thomas Indian School is Salem. And Salem was derived from asylum. And you know what an asylum is? It's for crazy people. So we were thought of as being crazy, I guess.
They were just considered bad people, bad children, but they weren't bad children, okay? They were placed there for so many different reasons, but not because of any kind of delinquency on their part.
So that video is so important to me, because I think that people fail to realize, all the monstrosities that were done to the indigenous population. I hear people still say very negative things about Native Americans. I recall being stationed, my husband was in Fort Sill, so we were in Lawton, Oklahoma, and that's Choctaw Nation, and I'm from Wisconsin, which is Oneida Nation. And just some of the comments that I would hear as if we were giving them a handout. And I think, gosh, all this land really belonged to them, but it was taken from them. There was no treaty. The treaties that were used with them were not the standard ones that were used with European nations. And then also, if you think about World War II, and the only code that could not be broken was the Navajo code talkers. Had they been successful in stripping the natives of their language and making them assimilate to this European, Eurocentric ideology and religion, then we may not have won the war. You know, so just something to consider. So home ownership is also another important mechanism. And we talked a little bit about that before, but when you think about, you know, institutional policies and practices, I hear a lot of people who say, well, you know, people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but they don't understand the institutional component when it comes to housing. So I, again, have a very short video about that.
It was a time when hundreds of thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans or the backing for loans to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. Tax dollars help make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course, in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, an interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home, we're interested in buying one, and what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even 1 or 2 non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized the national appraisal system, where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth, and on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
So that's another video that I think is really important, and for people to understand is the reality is that the federal government supported these policies. So we've seen the indigenous population and the, taking them away from their families with this ideal of assimilating them to this Eurocentric, religion, ideologies, and beliefs. Then we've seen African-American veterans who came back after serving in, our country, just like everyone else, but they were not able to utilize. At that point, it fell under the GI Bill, which now we know is our VA housing loan. And as a veteran myself, and I think there are many of you all on the call, every time we've moved, I've used my VA guaranteed home loan, every time we've purchased a home. So not to be able to do that, even though you've served and fought beside others, is problematic in itself. But the mere fact that the federal government subsidized, European Americans' ability to generate wealth, but did not do the same for others, is problematic. And you also may know in Jacksonville and in most major areas, most major cities, the government also provided urban renewal grants. So if you think of Durkeeville or La Villa, that area, and you look and you see the freeway running right through that area, those were viable African-American communities. But to help with white flight and suburbanization, the federal government gave cities federal dollars to build freeways to assist in that process. In Jacksonville, in sociology, we talk about an index of dissimilarity, and the US Census actually tracks that data. And in Jacksonville, the index of dissimilarity is 59%. And what that means is that one race would have to move. So basically, let's round up and say it's 60% is the index of dissimilarity. That means segregation within the city. So if we wanted a true integrated city in Jacksonville, 30% of African Americans would have to move into European American neighborhoods or vice versa. But at this point, we have the 60%, or the number 60, index of dissimilarity, and it goes from a zero to 100. Now, I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is the third most segregated metropolitan statistical area in America. And people always think it's the South, but we go Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee. So a lot of the Midwestern cities that had the late migration of African Americans come up are the ones that are more highly segregated than here. But when we see this segregation, what this leads to is schools that are in low income areas because they have not been invested in because of the ideal of, African Americans moving in a community, and then funds tend to be divested. And we see this when you look at gentrification as well. I know Springfield and certain areas are going through gentrification, and you have older people of color who have been in that community for many years, but now that housing prices are going up and they outright own their home, they're going to be taxed out of that area. So this cycle just continues to perpetuate itself, but it's just different mechanisms that are used to keep this.
And Tammy, isn't there also like a relationship to that kind of like that poverty scene with just education systems being funded based upon the property taxes, but the values of the homes are so devalued because those areas? I remember reading the piece on the corridor of shame of I-95, which is where I grew up. So
No, and thank you for bringing that up because you're spot on. So what happens is, just like you said, so in Duval County, 25% of property taxes go towards the schools. Well, then when you have low income areas, right, and the value of the homes are not as high, then, and we use the neighborhood school model here, then you end up with highly segregated schools. And we know that even though race is a social construct, there's a direct correlation between that and social economic status because of institutional, historical, and contemporary policies. So that's how you end up with Robert E. Lee High School being 99% African American and a Title I school, which means that a majority of the students there, a certain percentage receive free or reduced lunch. So as a sociologist, as I've moved with my husband during his military career, I always knew, because I believe, in public education, and I always knew that I needed to look for the best school district, and I knew how to do that. And I'll share with you, in Jacksonville, when we moved here, this is the first place that I've ever had to put my son in a private school, because the school, even though the district I live, the neighborhood I live in is of high quality, but we're mixed income housing, which is what I like, because then I think you get more diversity. The school is not rated like he was used to. So my son graduated from Episcopal High School here. So we came here 5 years ago, because he's a freshman at Florida State now. So he started his freshman year and he finished at Episcopal High School. But you're spot on. It's 25% in Duval County of your property taxes go towards the local school. So you see people moving out to St. Johns County, Nocatee, and places like that, because the schools have higher ratings, because the property taxes are high, the amount of money they get from the homes, which are assessed at a much higher value. So thank you so much for bringing that up. That is definitely true. And we see this growing wealth gap, right? And a lot of this, again, has to do with these institutional policies. If you think of the housing bust in 2008, you saw a disproportionate amount of minorities that were impacted. And the reality is that we continue to see institutional racism within banking. We've seen instances where minorities have had the same credit score, or potentially a better one, than a Caucasian family or a European American family, but they're not getting this, they're getting subprime loans. And that's problematic. And you heard, as a gentleman spoke about, like your housing, oftentimes you use that to help pay for your children to go to school. And that's how you create, that's part of the American dream. That's how you create generational wealth. Well, minorities have been locked out for so long. That's why we see the predicament and the situation that we still do. And studies continue to show us too, that if you have a certain amount of minorities that move into a neighborhood, that Caucasians will begin to move out, because it's been so embedded that if African Americans or Latinos move in your neighborhood, that the property value is going to go down. And that's not true, but that is so much, part of American culture and ideology, that a lot of people still believe that, and they respond to that. So that is another issue. Now we see, when we think about income based on race, which we know, right, is a social construct, and sex, we still see the disparity, right? So women continue to make less than men. if you make that person a woman of color, which is intersectionality, because now you hold two marginalized spaces, not only you a woman, but you're a woman of color, then you'll make even less. African American males tend to make less than Caucasian males, but Asian males tend to make more money and females than anyone else. But oftentimes, though, we tend to call those in the Asian community the model minority, with the understanding that those that are coming from Asia are the best of the best. You know, so they have the higher education and they're filling a lot of positions that we don't have qualified people to fill. You know, so when you look at your doctors and things like that, a lot of times you do have someone who is from Asia, but we just don't have enough people who are qualified for those roles. So we refer to them in sociology as the model minority, but that takes away any of the struggles that they've had. And believe me, they've had struggles as well. It just may look different. And not all Asians, you know, are part of that top 2% academically. I recall having a student when I was at UNF who was from Korea, and she was a sociology major. And she said one of her biggest pet peeves was people would ask her, why wasn't she majoring in science or math? Because that was the assumption, you must be in STEM. And she's like, I'm not good at science and math, you know, you know, but just that overgeneralization and those stereotypes fail to, you know, really take into consideration some of the struggles that people within these groups have had too, because we, again, tend to lump everybody together. So when we think about women and institutional inequality, oftentimes women could not own property, right? They didn't gain the right to vote until the 19th Amendment, which was in 1920. But for women of color in the South, that didn't apply to them because of Jim Crow laws and poll taxing and things of that nature. So we know there have been 3 women's movements. So the early 1900s, and that's when we got the 19th Amendment in 1920. But that movement really didn't, initially it did include women of color. Soldier and Truth gave a phenomenal speech about Ain't I a Woman Too? But the reality is that they were kind of left out of the movement with the passage of the 19th Amendment, because again, they didn't gain the right to vote in the South because of Jim Crow. The second women's movement we've seen, it was in the 60s, which was typically European American women who had received an education and who rightfully wanted to be in the workplace, rightfully so. And so they were fighting for that right. But women of color, whether they be Indigenous, Hispanic, Latina, or African American, Caribbean, or whatever, had been working since they had been here. So that really, again, was not very much of an inclusive movement. And now we're in a current movement and we're breaking glass ceilings and concrete ceilings. And it's much more inclusive to include our trans women as well, which I think is great, right? So it's not only including just women of color, but also our trans community as well. So I'm not sure how many of you all knew this, but until the 1970s, women had to get their husband's signature to get any credit. So the notorious RGB is RBG is one of the people who fought for our right? The past Supreme Court justice who fought for our right to be able to have credit. So she was instrumental in that and fought for a lot of those rights. So I wanted to do just a quick activity and have you think about this. And we'll just take a couple minutes and maybe we could have more dialogue after. But I want you to think about your own personal experiences and think of these origins of difference. And when did you become aware? So I'll just give you a couple minutes and just personally reflect. And at the end, we can kind of talk about it. Okay, everybody, remember your answers if you want to share, okay? And I'll share mine too. So we'll talk about that when we go into it. So I had talked about medical and like disparities and why you may see or hear, and I wish they were much clearer about why there's this mistrust in minority communities of the medical profession and of the vaccine. And that is because of situations like the Tuskegee experiment. I'm sure you all have heard of that. So there were African-American men that the government knew had syphilis. You know, they had tested positive for syphilis. And they told them in Tuskegee, Alabama, well, we're going to go ahead and treat you for that. And reality was that they didn't treat them at all. They wanted to see how the disease ran its course. But they told them they had bad blood and that they were treating them for it. But reality was they did not. That was not at all what they were doing. But Black bodies didn't really matter much. So if we're going to see how this disease progresses, then let's go ahead and watch with them. And this is even after they found, you know, penicillin was helpful and worked. They still allowed this experiment to go on to see, you know, the effects. And then eugenics was another mechanism. And that was really this ideal that only the best of the best should be able to have children. And we saw communities, particularly in the South, when low income and then African-American women became pregnant, oftentimes they would have them sign away their rights. They would allow them to have the baby, but if there were any complications or anything, or if they needed to be served, they would have them sign off on a form, basically unbeknownst to them, saying that once they had the baby, that they would go ahead and sterilize them. And that's exactly what they did. Because there was this ideal, if they're low income or they're of color, they're not the best of the best, so we should not want them to procreate anyway. I'm not sure how many of you all know this, but the father of the father of gynecology used to practice on slaves. And the ideal or his belief was that slaves or African Americans had a higher threshold for pain. So he did not use anesthesia. So a lot of the things that we benefit from now, you know, in that field was because this doctor, I won't call him a gentleman, but this doctor did these things to these African slaves or these African American women slaves. And again, with no pain relief, because the ideal was that they don't experience pain. And I think, you know, a lot of people may be aware, there was a doctor a couple of weeks ago, African-American female, who died from COVID, and she made a tape and she kept saying that like they weren't taking her serious. She was complaining of pain, but they were acting as if she was just trying to get pain medicine. And she's a doctor. She was an MD as well. And she ended up passing away. And we continue to see the bias within the medical field. And it's not the only field, but we do continue to see this bias and this ideal, you know, that African Americans have a higher pain threshold, that they're only there to get drugs and things of that nature. And it's just really misinformation and not correct.
Hey, Dr. Hodo.
Yes.
So we have a comment I just want to bring. I don't know if you're probably not able to monitor the chat on top of everything else going on. But Dr. Kalibi is on our board, and if you want to come off mute, Dr. K. So yeah, can you see the chat?
Let's see.
So it's like the second comment up.
Based on intersectionality. Let's see. Hold on. Give me one moment.
No worries. I just wanted to bring it up to your attention because I think it's an interesting comment. I just wanted to bring it to your.
Yeah, let me see. Hold on. I'm trying to find it. Sorry. Okay, I see people talking about the freeways down here.
Yeah, you have to scroll all the way to the bottom.
Okay, all this negative health outcomes like minority children being diagnosed with asthma. Is that the one? No, that's Kelsey.
No, ma'am. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see
gender-based.
Yep, there you go.
That's it. Okay. Exaggerate the difference due to time off, less hours worked, and personal preference for the same job pay is actually about the same. If it wasn't, smart companies would just hire all women and pocket the difference. There are many similar examples how capitalism is an equalizing factor. Most people talking statistics don't want to look at the actual figures that reflect progress. So I would say that we can definitely talk about that in regards to, I don't know if you know, but like in the legal field, they don't even have maternity leave. So yes, women tend to have to, take care of family as well as work. I don't know that we necessarily work less hours. You know, the statistical data and the data that continues to be reported, as well as qualitative, you know, when you have the actual conversations, continue to show that. Someone said that they disagree. At my old job, I was discriminated against based on my intersectionality. I had a high degree in spoken other language, and needed in the workplace, and was paid less than my white male counterpart, even though I had been with the company for almost 3 years and he had just been hired. I could see that. Where I worked in human resources, yeah, there is a huge disparity in gender wage gap. That, yeah, even for women who are not mothers, because the assumption is that we're going to take that time off, right?
Well, sure, but it is less hours. It's just that, you know, the how that's presented then makes it look like that's an hour for hour comparison rather than a career comparison, which does then make it look like more. You know, we don't need to go back and forth about it, and I think most people don't, you know, have come to their conclusions already. But I would say capitalism tends to be an equalizing factor because it's in companies' interests, of course, to pay the least amount they can pay. And there's been lots of examples where capitalism has actually been very positive about equalizing things. So,
right, but when it, well, let me ask you
in this current time, that's my experience. I mean, I see lots of people who choose to be successful. I see lots of successful women who choose to work less hours because that's how they want to do their life. They would rather not work the extreme hours. And, you know, that's a very common choice, which seems also not to get put into these calculations, right? So, I mean, obviously everyone has individual stories. I'm a white male, so my, you know, opinion is skewed, and, you know, but that is the statistics that I see. But once again, I'm pretty sure that people who have one opinion read one set of authors, and I think people who have a different opinion read a different set of authors. And I think that's part of the problem, rather than just pulling out all the general statistics. Would be a better comparison to look at.
Right. Well, as a sociologist, we tend to actually pull out the numbers from, like, I can tell you EEO, you know, what discrimination complaints were filed, how much money it cost companies. Most of them had to do with sex and disability. So this is data, you know, from the federal government. When you look at longevity in regards to position, it does depend. So in academia, right, professors tend to come in at the same level. If you come in as an assistant, it's going to be the same pay. But then if we look at who's getting tenure first, and we look at publications, let's say, and I'm a female of color, and I study women of color, and I publish in peer-reviewed journals, and you publish in journals that are perceived to be more mainstream because they're European geared, you know, then when it's time for tenure, oftentimes we're told, well, we don't really consider that mainstream, you know, and so there's a variety of other issues there as well. I mean, if I think of academia as well, then I think as a woman of color, oftentimes the assumption is I'm to sit on every diversity committee, which should not be the case. That I am to mentor minority students, which is not an issue for me, but see, that's something my white counterparts don't necessarily, particularly the men, have to contend with. So you have more time to research and focus on that, where oftentimes though others don't because of the underrepresentation. So we'll go on, but we can continue to talk though, okay? So how does discrimination function in the workplace? So Kelsey, love the name, right? So resumes with ethnic sounding names often are pushed down in the selection for interviews. Asian candidates, again, like I said, right, are often given priority positions requiring math and science, but that is just overgeneralizing and taking away from the individuality of that person as well as their experiences. Women more frequently interrupted in business meetings, and some team members who arrive late to meetings are welcomed and given a brief update, while others are kind of given the side eye look, like, where have you been? Why are you late? And so remember, we talked about Joe versus Jose last time. This shows you, right, where they would have the exact same qualifications, same resume. We just changed the name, and we see the differences in responses. So mass incarceration, right? We see there's a disparity between race and mass incarceration. 1 in 3 African-American men will be under the control of the criminal justice system. Oftentimes I'll hear comments like, well, what about Black on Black crime? Well, I'd like to let you know that crime is interracial. So Caucasians tend to kill and steal from other Caucasians. Asians tend to kill and steal from other Asians. African-Americans, the same thing. But the problem is when we look at the over-policing of certain communities, and when I say that, I'm not at all anti-police. I'm prior military, prior probation officer. But I do see, like, if I go in lower income areas, I do see more policing there versus where I live. You know, and I like community policing where there's a substation, you get to actually know the police, they know the people in the community, and they develop a relationship. But a lot of this also has to do with that disparity with crack versus cocaine. You know, so, you know, you had to have 100 times more of cocaine versus crack to get the exact same sentence. And we knew that lower income people were, again, there's that correlation between that social construct of race and social economic status due to historical and contemporary institutional policies, you know, sold crack, which was cheaper, you know, so we see that. So we've seen things, so we've seen basically go from slavery to the failure of Reconstruction to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. And so this just continues to be very problematic. Now, if we looked at sexuality in regards to inequality in the institutional component, we see that Eisenhower actually signed an executive order banning homosexuals from working for the federal government or any of its private contractors. So I have a contract with the VA in Dublin, Georgia, where I go and I teach them about cultural competency and how to work with our transgender veterans. And that contract would not exist, right? That type of education under an executive order like this. And not only would I not be able to teach them about the appropriate way to treat, speak, and provide medical care for those in the LGBTQI community who are veterans, but I wouldn't even be able to hire people who identify within that community to come in and teach, even though I've won that federal contract, because we could not. You know, so the first actual win was in 1958 in regards to a homosexual magazine. But I do want to say, though, in 2020, there was a win. This U.S. Supreme Court decided that Title VII does apply to our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex community. So I was really excited to see that. But we see historically, they described homosexuality as some sociopathic personality disturbance. You know, so not being able to be your authentic self, you know, and it is problematic in itself. Now, this is a really short video just about Stonewall, and then we're going to go into our conversation.
Today marks 50 years since the start of riots at the Stonewall Inn in New York City. A police raid led to a backlash that fueled the modern-day gay rights movement. CTM lead national correspondent, that's David Begnaud, is at the Stonewall Inn with the story of 2 men who witnessed that raid and the clashes that followed. David, good morning to you.
Gail, good morning to you. It happened in 1969, and you know who did it? The NYPD's Public Morals Squad. That was the thing back then. They raided the bar, but gay bars were commonly raided during that time period. What happened that was different was as the patrons were kicked out onto the street, they started to fight back. They picked up everything they could on the street and just started throwing it at the bar. And that led to the movement, which spread nationally. There was a bartender who was there that night, still works in the bar today. We start our story with him.
Hi, David. How you
Very
doing?
nice to meet you.
Same here.
He calls himself Tree Sequoia. He was a 30-year-old bartender when police raided the Stonewall.
We knew it was another raid, and all of a sudden we heard a crash, and somebody threw a rock through the window.
But this time, Stonewall patrons resisted arrest. The violence escalated, and eventually hundreds of people joined in. Mark Siegel was there too. Stonewall turned him into an activist.
From the very first day, it was, we're going to take back our identity. We're no longer going to allow society to label us. We'll be out loud and proud and in your face.
In 1973, Siegel stormed a live broadcast of the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. He held a sign saying, "Gays protest CBS prejudice," a message seen by millions of viewers. but Cronkite heard his message.
Homosexual men and women have organized to fight for acceptance and respectability.
Gay people have the same right.
Months later, CBS became one of the first networks to discuss gay rights. Just recently, the NYPD Commissioner James O'Neill apologized to the gay community.
The actions and the laws were discriminatory and oppressive.
Do you remember where you were when you decided I have to do this?
Wasn't sure I was going to do it until I got up to the podium, quite frankly. I said, you know, this has to be done. Otherwise, New York City is not going to be the place that it needs to be.
Despite the progress made since the riots, statistics show that tolerance for LGBTQ Americans, particularly among young people, has sharply decreased from 63% in 2016 to 45% last year.
A special bar.
Sarah Kate Ellis is president of GLAAD, one of the nation's leading gay rights advocacy organizations. Finish this for me. Our story today is
about joining forces with all marginalized people.
Since Stonewall, Pride has been a looking glass.
For 28-year-old Raymond Braun, the Stonewall riots are history, but it's an event that motivated him to travel around the country to places like Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a city that held its first gay pride parade in 2014, a journey documented in the film State of Pride.
We should be thinking about prides in literally every community. Even if 20 people show up, it's a couple rainbow flags and a picnic table. That's important.
You can't legislate acceptance. If you are not accepted, you are not safe, and you are not going to move through this world with the same rights, no matter what, as anybody else. Our stories are our most powerful tools for building acceptance.
You know, in 2016, President Obama declared the Stonewall Inn a national monument. So the Gay Pride March here in New York City happens on Sunday, and it coincides with World Pride. More than 2.5 million people are expected. Tony, I will leave you with this. Mark Siegel, who you saw in the story, who interrupted Walter Cronkite's newscast, said to me this week when I interviewed him, he said, David, if you remember nothing else, remember this. Pride means visibility.
David, thank you very much.
So that's just a short video that I like to share. I just think it's so important that we understand. I mean, it's not just one group that tends to be impacted, but a variety of groups. Let me just pull up the chat now. And then I also wanted to say to the other doctor on the line, you know, white men have diversity too, because I kind of got the feeling that you didn't think that white men, you know, could have these conversations, but you have diversity of thought, you have diversity of experience, all kind of stuff. So, I mean, I never want anyone to think that, you know, they can't contribute, because that's not true. Geographical differences, thought process, all these other differences, right? That we all bring, and we're all diverse. I'm from Wisconsin. I could say, well, you know, where's the bubbler? To me, that's the water fountain. You know, so just geographically, right? So please don't ever feel that you do not have anything to contribute, because you do indeed have something to contribute. Everybody does, because we're all in this together. We have more similarities than we do differences. So with that, I wanted to ask, what did you guys think of that activity? Like, when did you first realize the difference, you know, between sexes, right? Which is the biological component. Did anybody want to share?
Do you want us to share,
yeah,
like speaking or in the chat?
Yeah, I would love for you to speak.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'll talk about it. I was thinking about several of those questions and just how so many of those differences became apparent to me, not because of observations I had, but because of, well, and potentially through observations, but not necessarily observations of like biological difference, but socialized differences. And so like, especially between the sexes, like thinking about, oh, well, girls wear pink, boys wear blue, girls play with these toys, boys play with these toys. I'm a boy, so I don't do XYZ thing. These kind of rules that were like everywhere, that were just kind of part of the fabric of where I grew up. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and I
thanks for
mean,
that.
so you know, Target was like one of the first ones that kind of tried to do away with that, because it's so rigid, right? You know, like girls should wear pink and girls should present this certain way, like this ideal of gender expression. But not everybody fits in those boxes all neatly like that, right? Because you have people who are born a woman but don't even identify that way, or at least with their gender expression. I'm more comfortable in jeans and gym shoes than I am in a dress or a skirt. You know, I mean, so it depends on but I agree with you. Everything is very gendered. So like when I think about race, right, even though we know that's a social construct, with me, the sex one was pretty early on because I have a brother. You know, and a sister, but the brother. And then with the race one, that again was early on for me too, because my parents were an interracial couple. My father's passed away now, but so it was very obvious, right? My dad had this beautiful dark complexion, and my mom had a pretty milky complexion, you know, so that was pretty easy for me to notice. What about socioeconomic status? Like, when did anybody notice the differences in classes?
I'll jump in. I grew up Southern Baptist, really strict Christian. So it was pointed out to me really early on. It was probably age 4 to 5 where we started making it very clear that we did not have, because we were not allowed to have. That was against our religion. So early on in my life, my family really started pointing out what these people have and why they have it and why we do not and why we never should. Mm-hmm. So it was early.
Oh yeah. And see, and I think about that one. So I will tell you, one of my biggest pet peeves is the whole thing with homophobia in Black and brown communities. So I see like the oppressed become the oppressor, you know. So in Jamaica, in the Black American community, and in the Hispanic American community, and a lot of Black and brown communities and countries, the level of homophobia is ridiculous. You know, and it's amazing to me, because I'm just like, really, they have laws still in Jamaica against homosexual relationships. If you're found out to be particularly a gay male in Jamaica, you could be killed, and it won't be investigated. You know, but when I see the oppressed become the oppressor, it's so problematic for me. And that's what I see a lot in the Black and brown communities. But I also see that when I think of early European immigrants, the Irish, Polish, and Italian, and Greek, who have been absorbed into the construct of whiteness. And I think of Boston and race relations between African Americans and the Irish. And I'm like, are you serious? You know, because like the Irish were not treated well. They were treated rather poorly. They came during the potato famine. They were not considered, you know, so-called white. And then you see, again, the oppressed become the oppressor. So it's like this whole stratification and this need to feel better than someone else. And it's just mind-boggling to me. Did anyone else want to, ask or talk about anything or share?
I'll share.
Okay, go ahead,
Okay,
Laura.
awesome, Laura. Go ahead, Laura.
You asked about socioeconomic difference. I grew up with next door neighbor kind of people that we played with. My brother and I got to go on vacation for 2 weeks every summer. Our next door neighbors not.
Yep. And that's an indication, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. And socioeconomic status, that matters, you know. And Kelsey, I think you were going to share too.
Yeah, I was actually going to say that these questions were hard for me to answer, and I think it's because I came from a pretty conservative family that doesn't talk about those things, and so I have stories of, I don't remember when I learned. I know, like, I have memories and stories of like my brother learning these things when I was a little bit older, and it was coming up for him, and so I remember like him experiencing it. But yeah, there's a lot of I was a lot older when when I became aware of a lot of these things. So that's an interesting point to make too.
Yeah. Well, to me too, with me too, like the sexuality, I would say I was older when I realized, because I just didn't know. I mean, we were brought up in a household, like, no holds bar, obviously, because the parents married in 1962 and my mother was a trailblazer, but we just weren't exposed. But I knew not to judge anybody based on, anything like that. But I would say that was the last one I learned about, was like noticing difference in sexuality.
Yeah, like I know that my family moved, like we have like my family moved from a affluent area I grew up in Maryland, so an affluent area in Annapolis, Maryland, to a suburb because my parents didn't want me going to the public schools because there were people of lower socioeconomic status there and didn't want me there. So that was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the exact opposite experience of what Kelsey described, where I was grew up with a wide variety of all the different diversities, in part just of growing up in a very diverse, lower socioeconomic neighborhood, but also my mom being a nurse and having friends who were trans and, you know, all the LGBTQ, like I was raised around that. So it was always present. So I don't remember it coming up because I was so young and it was always talked about. My mom being a nurse, you know, when my brothers were born and had penises and I did not, like, I mean, it was just very, you know, very out there, all of the conversations. So I don't remember the conversations about the differences, but I do remember like my first experience of recognizing that like racism existed. And I remember we moved out of that diverse area into the suburbs and suddenly like it was very obvious racism and the N-word. And I remember like calling my grandfather on one of my friends because her mom was the guidance counselor and saying, she used the N-word, she's racist. You have to like call the school board and her mother has to be fired because they can't have a racist person working at the school. And my grandfather having to explain like, there are many racist people, like it's out there. We have to be, you know, eyes open to it all the time. Don't be colorblind, fight it, you know, bring it up. But it was like the exact like opposite direction where it was like, oh no, like look at all this like terribleness that's out there.
But see, but that's what I'm saying. Everybody has something to contribute because we all have different experiences. So I grew up, like I said, in Milwaukee, which is the third most segregated metropolitan statistical area in America, right? But I grew up on the white side of town. So there was only one other biracial family. My parents married in 1962 before it was even legal in the South because Loving versus Virginia didn't go to the Supreme Court until 1967. But my parents really had it all figured out because what they would do is my mom, who's blonde hair and blue eyed, would go take care of everything and then we would appear. You know, so at that point, it's like all the business has been taken care of. We're your new neighbors, you know? So, I mean, but they learned early on what they had to do. Initially, they didn't know that. She said when they got married, because of housing covenants and redlining, she had to move into the inner city and she was the only Caucasian or European American in that space, you know, and she said that was really new to her. And it was a lower social class than she had come from because they had all these people pushed, you know, into these rentals like they talked about in the video, where she came from, you know, like this kind of German enclave where everybody owned their house and a business and, you know, all these other things. So it was for her, I think much later in life when she learned, you know, about the differences of particular things. So, but yeah, I think we think about social economic status and all that good stuff, you know, that's always something that we need to be considerate of. And like we have just one child. So with him, you know, being able to send him to Episcopal was definitely because class-wise we could afford to, you know, but a lot of people don't have that option. So you have to, you know, to kind of go with it. So any other comments or questions?
Tammy, you know, on one of your slides, you had homosexuality was considered a mental illness. And I remember that's what my mother was taught growing up. And, you know, she was brought up in the Catholic Church and went to Catholic schools. And the irony is of course, the scandals that they've had. But I remember her telling me that as I might have been in like middle school, because I really didn't understand what all of that was. And she shared that with me. And I remember thinking that seems so strange, but I didn't really grasp it all at that age. But that's what had been ingrained in her throughout her life.
Yeah.
She's since evolved.
But though my mom, hell, it was ingrained in her that African Americans were porch monkeys, that Irish people were drunks, that Polish people were not very smart, that, you know, I mean, all these negative things, right? And then she goes to college at 18, and she said she, you know, thought she did a favor by allowing this African-American young lady who was late to class to sit by her. She said, I thought I did her a big favor by allowing her to sit by me. Well, obviously my mother has evolved, because I would not be here, right? Had she not. So that's the whole point, right? Is the learning process, and we're constantly learning. But I mean, my mom, and not much difference, you know, different thing. Hers was religion. My mother's was very racialized, you know? So, I mean, and she just, the things she told me that they told her about Italians, you know, and that's why I'm always amazed at the, you know, the continued issue when it comes to racism within groups, because it's like we're all just one kind of being, and that's human, and that's it, you know. And I mean, there are people who are born who don't identify with the sex they were born. But I guess my whole point is, what business is that of mine? Like, why should that bother me? You know, you know, and just trying to educate people that it's really, you know, we should just love one another, you know, and try to gain an understanding and keep it moving. So,
yeah.
Any other questions?
May I share?
Yes, please, please.
Hi, Dr. Hodo. This is Matilda. So as I've been thinking, as people have been sharing, I'm realizing that every time that I got one of these distinctions was actually from someone else saying something to me, like in first or second grade in the bathroom, one of the little girls was like talking about, told me like how boys are different down there. And she's like, you know, some people like want to turn into a boy. I was like, oh, what? I don't want to be a boy. You know, like I had this whole, but I didn't know there was even an option or a difference. Or noticing race. Like I remember in my neighborhood, we had different races, and it didn't really occur to me that there was a difference until someone mentioned it to me. Like I noticed a difference in skin tone, but it didn't have a significance until someone made it significant, right? And same thing with the socioeconomics. I didn't realize how well I'd grown up until college, and my roommate told me she grew up in a trailer park and you know, shared about her experience. So yeah, just like, I guess maybe I wasn't aware because of my surroundings, but other
That
people
might
made
be,
me aware.
but that might be a good thing. So apparently it wasn't important to your parents. You know what I'm saying? To make that distinction. So I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that says a lot about your parents, that like it wasn't something that they felt that you know, they needed to really make a big to do about, or a distinction, you know. So we could definitely look at that as a good thing. You know, I know I work with my son, you know, and try to, you know, share things with him, because he's African-American, you know, 18-year-old in college, and just, you know, trying to get him, coming from Episcopal though, right? So he was one of 9 out of a class of 150 that graduated in 2020. You know, so I don't know how many of you all saw, but like this summer they had Black at Bowes, Black at ESJ, Black at Douglas Anderson, in these Instagram posts where these African-American students talked about their experiences in this predominantly white space, you know, and some of them, it was very problematic, and, you know, others did not have, you know, major issues. One of the things I noticed though, as a parent, was when I saw with Episcopal, because I was tracking them both, it was student on student. But when I looked at Bowles, it seemed like it was the faculty and staff imposing this on the students. And that was just from the ones that I read, you know. And so that sometimes it is very problematic, because it's like, so that's embedded in that whole educational institution, and it needs to be deconstructed. So any other questions? I know I kept you guys over time, but I wanted to make sure that I was here to answer any questions, you know, or have any additional conversation that you guys would like to have. Yeah, and you're right. Female dominated professions are typically undervalued. Think about educators, right? Teachers starting here at $39,000 a year. 39, and you have to have a bachelor's degree. And you know, teachers don't go into it to make money, but could like we actually pay them some money, because they're really frontline. They're not only teachers, they're social workers, they're nurses, they're, you know, everything, right? But we tend not to value them as much. Social work, my mom's a retired social worker for battered women. Her Social Security is a joke. I mean, when I came out of college with a bachelor's as a probation officer, I was making more than she was. You know, so yeah, I agree. You know, there are certain positions that we do see that inequality regarding pay, anything that's perceived to be women's work or that service level, first line, front line type work, we also see that disparity. So if there's no more questions, I really appreciate you all. I've enjoyed myself. I will make sure that I send a survey. If you have any follow-up questions, please email me. I'm Tammy at All Things Diverse. I hope that you all have a fabulous evening, and I truly appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hodo. We really
Thank you. That was awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Everyone have a good evening. Let's go and relax. I think we've all been
Celebrate.
right.
Go celebrate.
I know, right?
It's a big day.
It is. It is. I agree. Let's celebrate.
Go celebrate. Got my glitter shirt on.
I love it. You see, I got my pearls on. I'm like, hey, what is that about the Go Bills? I'm from Wisconsin. I'm rooting for Green Bay to get in the Super Bowl here. What's up with that?
Tammy, my team hasn't been in the playoffs in 25 years. 25 years, Tammy. 25.
I got it.
They missed the field goal. Just saying.
My first sports memory is the Super Bowl where they missed a field goal. That's my first, and I have been a Bills fan ever since. That was.
And look, Forrest is gonna make sure you know that they missed the field goal. You're a mess, and I like it, Forrest. I like it.
Go to Wisconsin, go Bucks.
Yeah, Tammy, he's another veteran, so he's got, he knows exactly what to say.
Exactly, Forrest. I like you. You are the man. Go Bucks. Go, go Packers. You guys have a great evening. And again, thank you so much.
Good.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Susie, can you stop the recording?
Yes. Where? I thought I could.
Oh, I can. Stop it?
Yeah, if you can see it, it's not, I don't have an obvious option.